in the quiet town of Aberdeen, Australia, a young girl was growing up surrounded by chaos. Violence was not something she saw on television, it was something she lived through every single day. Katherine Knight's childhood was defined by fear, anger, and instability. Her parents' relationship was marked by infidelity, abuse, and constant conflict. From a young age, she learned that love could hurt, and trust was something fragile and dangerous. At school, Katherine was withdrawn yet unpredictable. Teachers noticed her violent temper, while classmates feared her sudden outbursts. Behind her piercing eyes was a storm, one that no one truly understood. The emotional scars left by her family's dysfunction began to shape her view of relationships, control, and punishment. What began as childhood trauma would one day evolve into something far darker. This story is not just about a crime, it is about how a lifetime of pain, abuse, and emotional chaos can twist the human mind. As we uncover the shocking path that led Katherine Knight from victim to the most infamous female offender in Australian history, we will explore the disturbing psychology behind her actions and the chilling lessons her story leaves behind. If you are fascinated by true crime, psychological mysteries, and real-life stories that challenge our understanding of human nature, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every week, we dive deep into the world's most haunting cases, revealing not just what happened, but why it happened. Stay with us, because this is one story you will never forget. As Katherine grew older, the darkness that had surrounded her childhood began to seep into her adult life. What she had witnessed in her family, the shouting, the betrayal, the violence became a pattern she unconsciously repeated. When most teenagers were learning about love and trust, Katherine was learning how to dominate, to control, and to hurt before being hurt. Her first relationships were a reflection of her inner chaos. To the outside world, she appeared passionate and intense, but behind closed doors, that passion could turn terrifying. Those who became close to her often described the same experience. At first, she was magnetic, affectionate, even protective. She had a way of making her partners feel chosen, as if they were the only ones who truly understood her. But that illusion never lasted. Small disagreements could ignite her temper, transforming warmth into rage within seconds. Jealousy consumed her like a fever. Any perceived slight, a look, a delay, a whisper of betrayal could push her over the edge. In those moments, reason disappeared, and violence became her only language of control. Her first serious relationship with a man named David Kellett revealed just how dangerous her emotions could be. Theirs was a union driven by intensity, both physical and emotional. Yet the more she loved, the more she needed to possess. Friends recalled violent arguments, unpredictable outbursts, and terrifying threats. She could go from laughter to fury without warning. On one occasion, when she felt abandoned, her rage erupted so violently that even those closest to her feared for their safety. Despite this, David stayed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pity, or perhaps because he, too, was trapped in the cycle of dysfunction that Katherine had always known. As the years passed, each new relationship followed a similar pattern, the same intoxicating beginnings, the same emotional explosions, the same dangerous end. For Katherine, love was not a gentle connection between two people. It was a battle for power, a test of loyalty, and an arena where her deepest wounds fought for dominance. She demanded complete devotion, yet offered no stability in return. Each partner became both her lover and her target, drawn into a whirlwind they could not escape. Katherine's temper became legendary in the small communities she lived in. Stories circulated of knives thrown in fits of rage, of threats whispered in the dark, of objects shattered across the room. Her behavior swung between tenderness and torment, leaving those around her uncertain of who she truly was. There were moments when she seemed remorseful, even broken by her own actions, but the calm never lasted. The anger always returned, stronger each time, as though she was fighting against an invisible force that had followed her since childhood. By her late 20s, Katherine's life was a series of fractured relationships and violent confrontations. Yet, to many, she still appeared functional, holding steady jobs, keeping up appearances, even charming those who did not know her well. But beneath that surface, the psychological wounds of her past had never healed. They had only deepened, feeding the resentment and paranoia that would one day spiral beyond control. In every relationship, she relived the same tragedy. The young girl who once feared being powerless had become the woman who would do anything to maintain control. And as her violence grew more unpredictable, those closest to her began to realize that love, in Katherine Knight's world, was not an emotion, it was a weapon. By the time Katherine met John Price, the patterns that had defined her earlier relationships were already firmly entrenched. And yet, something about him drew her in, as if fate were orchestrating another chapter in her turbulent life. Their connection began with an intensity that felt thrilling, almost magnetic, but beneath the surface lay the same storm that had haunted Katherine since her youth. The initial stages of their relationship were filled with passion and excitement, a sense of escape from the loneliness and anger that had shadowed her for years. However, this exhilaration was always tempered by the looming spectre of conflict, and it was not long before arguments began to flare, each one more volatile than the last. Katherine's temper, once confined to private moments, now became a constant presence in her interactions with John. Small disagreements would escalate with alarming speed, transforming ordinary conversations into battlegrounds where words became weapons. Jealousy and suspicion seemed to guide her actions, prompting accusations and ultimatums that left John perpetually on edge. The cycle of affection followed by aggression created a suffocating environment, a rhythm neither could escape. Friends and neighbors observed the tension, sensing the danger but powerless to intervene in a relationship that seemed bound by mutual obsession as much as by love. Domestic abuse became an undeniable part of their lives, a shadow that hung over every encounter. Physical confrontations were punctuated by heated arguments, each incident leaving lasting scars, both visible and invisible. Even when the violence subsided, the aftermath lingered in the form of emotional manipulation, threats, and attempts to maintain control over each other's lives. Despite moments of reconciliation, the toxicity of their bond only intensified, reinforcing the destructive patterns that neither could break. The pair separated on multiple occasions, each attempt at distance proving temporary. Katherine's inability to relinquish control clashed with John's attempts to assert his independence, creating a dynamic that drew them back together repeatedly, as if an invisible force compelled them toward each other despite the inevitable pain. Every reunion ignited the storm, with old resentments resurfacing and new conflicts emerging, leaving a trail of fear and heartbreak in its wake. Underlying their destructive cycle was a deeper, unspoken tension rooted in Katherine's past. The violent tendencies and emotional instability that had shaped her life continued to influence her decisions, leading her into situations where anger and revenge seemed to overshadow reason and compassion. John, for his part, became entwined in a web of emotional manipulation, struggling to understand how someone he cared for could alternate so dramatically between love and hostility. Their relationship became a microcosm of Katherine's lifelong struggle, a constant battle between desire and destruction, affection and aggression. Ultimately, the bond between Katherine and John ended tragically, as the unresolved conflicts and escalating violence reached a point from which there was no recovery. The relationship that had begun with attraction and intensity devolved into a narrative of fear, manipulation, and irreversible consequences. Those who witnessed it from the outside were left grappling with disbelief and sorrow, trying to comprehend how a connection so charged with passion could culminate in devastation. In Katherine's world, love had never been a sanctuary. It was a mirror of her inner turmoil, reflecting back the chaos and rage that had shaped her since childhood. Her relationship with John Price was no exception, illustrating how unresolved pain and emotional instability could perpetuate cycles of violence and despair. It became a stark reminder that for some, the bonds that draw people together are inseparably intertwined with the forces that eventually tear them apart, leaving a legacy of tragedy that neither time nor remorse could undo. By the year 2000, the tension and volatility that had defined Katherine Knight's life and her relationship with John Price reached a catastrophic apex, culminating in a violent episode that would forever scar the collective consciousness of Australia. The months leading up to that fateful event were marked by increasingly erratic behavior and a deepening obsession with control, reflecting a mind consumed by rage and a desire to assert dominance in ways that defied comprehension. Those close to her had witnessed glimpses of her capacity for anger, but nothing could have prepared anyone for the extreme lengths to which her fury would extend. It was as though every unresolved trauma from her childhood, every instance of jealousy, every bruised ego, and every previous conflict with John had coalesced into a single, horrifying moment of unleashed violence. The confrontation itself unfolded in a manner both shocking and incomprehensible. Long-standing animosities and the turbulent history between them ignited, resulting in a level of aggression that escalated beyond the control of either party. In a state driven by a complex interplay of psychological instability and an overwhelming sense of betrayal, Katherine carried out actions that stunned observers for their sheer brutality. The sequence of events was marked not only by physical violence, but also by a symbolic assertion of power, reflecting a psyche that had been shaped by years of exposure to abuse and emotional volatility. The extremity of the act was such that it left an indelible impression on all who later learned the details, challenging notions of human behavior and the capacity for rage when personal boundaries and emotions are repeatedly violated. In the aftermath, the scale and nature of the violence became the focal point of public and media attention. The details of what had occurred, acts that demonstrated an unparalleled level of physical and psychological intensity, prompted widespread shock and disbelief, both within Australia and internationally. News outlets dissected the events with a mixture of fascination and horror, attempting to reconcile the human elements of Katherine's life with the unthinkable outcome. Commentators and psychologists sought to understand how a lifetime of trauma, combined with specific relational dynamics, could manifest in such an extreme and tragic incident. The story became more than a criminal case. It evolved into a study of human pathology, a cautionary tale illustrating the devastating consequences when untreated psychological instability intersects with obsession and intimate conflict. As legal authorities intervened, the narrative surrounding Katherine Knight transformed into a complex portrait of a person driven by forces both internal and circumstantial. Her prior experiences, exposure to domestic dysfunction, early patterns of aggression, and cycles of destructive relationships were revisited in an effort to contextualize, though never excuse, the extremity of her actions. Each new account reinforced the understanding that the trajectory of her life had been characterized by escalating patterns of violence and control, a trajectory that culminated in a single, tragic incident that defied easy explanation. The story of Katherine and John became emblematic of the dangers inherent in unresolved trauma and the destructive potential of intimate relationships marred by abuse and obsession. It served as a stark reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary interactions, hidden forces of rage and instability can accumulate over time, eventually erupting in acts that leave a permanent mark on the lives of everyone involved. The world's reaction, a mixture of disbelief, fear, and morbid curiosity, underscored the profound impact of her actions. And the case entered the annals of history, not merely as a criminal event, but as a narrative that continues to provoke reflection on the human capacity for violence. Ultimately, The events of 2000 crystallized the culmination of years of psychological unrest and relational conflict, producing an outcome that was both tragic and extraordinary. Katherine Knight's actions shattered the ordinary expectations of human behavior and served as a chilling testament to how cycles of trauma, unchecked aggression, and personal obsession can intersect with devastating consequences. In recounting her story, one confronts the darkest dimensions of human experience, recognizing the fragile boundaries between control and chaos, love and destruction, and ultimately, between life as it is lived and life as it is violently altered in an instant. In the wake of the horrifying events, experts and observers alike were confronted with the difficult task of unraveling the psychological forces that had driven Katherine Knight to such extremes. And debates emerged around whether her actions were rooted in mental illness, a thirst for revenge, or the pursuit of some darker, more disturbing form of satisfaction. Psychologists and criminal behavior specialists examined her history, tracing patterns of aggression, jealousy, and emotional volatility back to her formative years, where exposure to a chaotic and abusive family environment had sown seeds of instability that would later manifest in unpredictable and destructive ways. These patterns, evident in her relationships and interpersonal conflicts, suggested a mind in which boundaries between anger and attachment, control and affection, had long since blurred, creating a volatile inner landscape prone to extreme reactions under stress or perceived betrayal. Further examination revealed that Knight displayed characteristics commonly associated with both borderline and antisocial personality disorders, including intense mood swings, a heightened sensitivity to perceived rejection, and a persistent difficulty in regulating emotions. She exhibited a remarkable lack of empathy, struggling to understand or value the feelings of others, and her actions were often devoid of remorse, even in situations where the consequences of her behavior were catastrophic. This combination of traits, coupled with her long-standing patterns of controlling behavior and aggression, provided a lens through which experts attempted to understand the escalation of her violence. Each interaction, each confrontation with John Price, and each prior incident of conflict seemed to reinforce her inability to maintain healthy relationships, gradually entrenching a mindset in which extreme measures became a distorted form of problem-solving and assertion of dominance. The analysis of her psychological profile also invited broader reflection on the interplay between nature and nurture in shaping human behavior. While some argued that her actions were the inevitable result of deeply ingrained mental health issues, others posited that environmental factors, particularly the cycle of abuse and exposure to dysfunctional relationships, had catalyzed and magnified tendencies toward aggression and sadistic impulses. In the eyes of these experts, the boundaries between clinical diagnosis and lived experience were complex and intertwined, with each violent act representing not only an immediate eruption of anger, but also the culmination of decades of unresolved trauma, internalized rage, and distorted perceptions of control and loyalty. What made Knight's behavior particularly alarming was the degree of premeditation and ritualistic intensity she displayed, which suggested that her motivations extended beyond simple emotional outburst. Analysts speculated that elements of revenge and sadistic gratification may have been present, reflecting a mind capable of deriving a perverse sense of satisfaction from asserting power over another person in the most intimate and horrifying ways. Yet even as they grappled with this possibility, it remained clear that any attempt to isolate a single cause, whether mental illness, vengeance, or inherent cruelty, was fraught with difficulty. For her psychological makeup was both multifaceted and deeply resistant to simplistic explanations. In exploring the contours of Knight's psyche, one cannot ignore the interplay of personality pathology with lived experience, where repeated exposure to trauma, rejection, and intimate conflict shaped not only her actions but her perception of morality, justice, and human connection. Her capacity for cruelty was intertwined with moments of vulnerability, illustrating a deeply fractured individual whose inner life was dominated by oscillations between attachment and aggression, longing and hostility. Experts highlighted that her lack of remorse did not arise from callousness alone, but from a fundamental disconnection from conventional moral frameworks. A disconnection that had been nurtured and reinforced over the course of her life by both circumstance and innate predisposition. Ultimately, the examination of Katherine Knight's mental state offers a chilling insight into the complex architecture of human behavior, revealing how a combination of personality disorders, unresolved trauma, and potentially sadistic tendencies can converge to produce acts of extraordinary violence. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the boundaries of empathy, the consequences of unaddressed psychological disturbance, and the ways in which a lifetime of instability can culminate in a single, unforgettable tragedy, leaving a lasting imprint on both the legal record and the collective consciousness of a society struggling to comprehend the extremes of human nature. Katherine Knight's sentencing marked a chilling milestone in Australian criminal history, as she became the first woman in the country to receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A verdict that reflected not only the severity of her actions, but also the societal shock that her case provoked. Courts and the public alike struggled to reconcile the image of a woman, often stereotyped as nurturing and passive, with the brutal reality of her crimes, which defied conventional expectations and challenged long-held assumptions about gender and violence. The details of her actions, meticulously planned, horrifyingly executed, and emotionally charged, highlighted a level of premeditation and psychological disturbance that compelled the legal system to respond with unprecedented severity, ensuring that she would never be able to harm another person. Knight's case continues to resonate beyond the courtroom, serving as a stark reminder of the potential extremes of domestic violence and the dangers of unchecked psychological instability. Experts and commentators have often used her story as a lens to examine the intersection of mental illness, trauma, and violent behavior, raising awareness about warning signs that can escalate into catastrophic outcomes if left unaddressed. By understanding the patterns that led to such a tragic event, society gains critical insight into the importance of early intervention, psychological support, and the prevention of intimate partner violence. Her life sentence stands not only as a legal punishment, but also as a somber symbol of the consequences that can arise when personal turmoil, emotional volatility, and interpersonal conflict spiral beyond control. For historians, criminologists, and the general public, the story of Katherine Knight underscores the complexity of human behavior, particularly in contexts where trauma, personality disorders, and relational dysfunction converge. It challenges us to look beyond surface assumptions and confront uncomfortable truths about how violence can manifest in forms that defy stereotypes, demanding careful consideration of both individual responsibility and societal influences. Her case continues to be studied in academic settings, cited in discussions of extreme criminal behavior, and referenced in debates on domestic violence, illustrating how a single event can leave a lasting imprint on legal precedent. Psychological research and public consciousness. As we reflect on this harrowing story, it is important to remember that while the details may shock and disturb, they also provide critical lessons about vigilance, empathy, and the importance of addressing early warning signs in relationships. The tragedy of Katherine Knight's life and crimes reminds us that violence can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that understanding the underlying causes is essential to preventing future harm. By sharing these stories responsibly, we honor the memory of victims, educate the public, and foster awareness that can ultimately save lives. Thank you for joining us as we explored this dark and complex chapter of history. If you found this content insightful and want to learn more about true crime, historical cases, and psychological analysis. Please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to light, helping viewers understand the intricate and often disturbing dimensions of human behavior, while promoting awareness, education, and thoughtful discussion about the issues that shape our society. Stay tuned for more in-depth explorations, and thank you again for watching.